Hello everyone, this is Dr. Ashwati, Associate Professor, Department of English at KAHM Unity Women's College, Manjeri. This presentation focuses on Gerard Manley Hopkins' celebrated sonnet titled The Windhover. This poem is regarded as one of the finest achievements of Victorian poetry because it combines intense observation of nature with profound spiritual reflection. Hopkins transforms the sight of a bird in flight into an exploration of divine beauty, religious devotion, sacrifice, and artistic expression. As we move through the presentation, we will examine the poem's thematic concerns, structure, symbolism, language, and religious significance. We will also study the poem within the broader context of Hopkins' poetic innovations, especially his unique use of sound, rhythm, and imagery. The current lecture aims to demonstrate how Hopkins elevates the simple natural scene into a deeply philosophical and theological meditation. By the end of the session, we will be able to appreciate why Windhover remains central to the study of Victorian poetry and modern poetic experimentation. Gerard Manley Hopkins was born on 20th July 1844 in Stratford, Essex, England. He belonged to the Victorian age, a period marked by rapid industrialization, scientific advancement, and religious uncertainty. The social and intellectual tensions deeply influenced his poetry. Hopkins converted to Roman Catholicism while studying at Oxford University. His conversion was a decisive moment in his life because it led to his estrangement from parts of mainstream Victorian society. Later, he joined the Jesuit order and became a priest. His religious vocation strongly shaped both his personal life and his poetic vision. In addition to being a poet, Hopkins worked as a professor of classics. His scholarly training contributed to the intellectual density of his poetry. Unlike many Victorian poets who sought smooth and accessible language, Hopkins developed a highly compressed style filled with unusual syntax, compound words, and intense sound patterns. Among his major works are Spring and Fall, Pied Beauty, Carrion Comfort, and God's Grandeur. These poems reveal his recurring concern with nature, spiritual conflict, divine presence, and human suffering. It is really important to note that Hopkins's poetry was not widely recognized during his lifetime. Most of his poems, including The Windhover, were published posthumously in 1918. As a result, Hopkins is often seen as a poet who anticipated many aspects of modernist experimentation. The Windhover was written on 30th May 1877. The title refers to the kestrel, a bird of prey known for its ability to hover motionless in the air while searching for prey. Hopkins uses this bird not merely as an object of observation but as a symbolic figure carrying spiritual significance. The poem was published after Hopkins' death and it was published in 1918, which means that its influence was recognized only in the 20th century. Today, it is considered as one of Hopkins' greatest poetic accomplishments because of its originality and emotional power. The poem combines natural imagery with religious symbolism. Hopkins begins with a vivid description of the kestrel's flight, but gradually the poem moves towards spiritual contemplation. Nature becomes a means of approaching divine truth. The poem is also dedicated to Christ our Lord. This dedication is extremely important because it guides the interpretation of the poem. The kestrel is not simply a bird, it becomes a symbolic representation of Christ's majesty, sacrifice, and spiritual power. Through this fusion of natural observation and theological meditation, Hopkins demonstrates how physical reality can reveal divine presence. The poem therefore operates simultaneously as a nature poem, a devotional poem, and a philosophical reflection. The poem begins with the speaker observing the kestrel flying in the morning sky. The bird appears majestic, graceful, and powerful. Hopkins carefully describes its movement in order to capture both its physical beauty and its symbolic significance. The octave or the first 8 lines of the sonnet focuses mainly on the bird's movement and energy. The speaker admires the kestrel's mastery over the wind and the sky. The language conveys excitement and admiration. In the sestet, which is the final 6 lines, the poem undergoes a shift. The focus moves away from the external description towards spiritual reflection. The speaker interprets a bird's flight as an expression of divine power. The kestrel becomes associated with Christ. Its beauty and strength symbolize spiritual glory, while its descent suggests sacrifice and humility. This transition from natural description to religious meditation is central to the poem's meaning. Ultimately, the poem explores themes such as transcendence, beauty, sacrifice, and spiritual revelation. Hopkins suggests that the moment of intense beauty in nature can lead human beings towards deeper understanding of the divine. The first quotation, I caught this morning's minion, kingdom of daylight's dauphin, dappled on drawn falcon, immediately demonstrates Hopkins' distinctive style. The phrase morning's minion presents the bird as a favorite or a servant of the morning, while the daylight's dauphin compares it to a prince. Through these royal images, Hopkins elevates kestrel into a majestic and noble figure. The use of compound expressions such as dappled on drawn creates a musical and dynamic effect. Hopkins compresses multiple sensory impressions into a single phrase. This technique reflects his attempt to capture the uniqueness of the bird's appearance and movement. The second quotation, my heart in hiding still for a bird, reveals the speaker's emotional response. The phrase heart in hiding suggests an inner spiritual condition. The sight of the kestrel awakens the speaker emotionally and spiritually. Now the final quotation, no wonder of it, sheer plowed makes plow down Cillian shine, and blue black embers gash cold vermilion, introduces an important philosophical idea. Hopkins suggests that even ordinary labor and suffering can produce beauty and illumination. The plow cutting earth and embers glowing after breaking apart symbolize spiritual transformation. These quotations demonstrate how Hopkins combined visual imagery, sound patterns, and spiritual reflections within highly compressed language. One of the central themes of poem is the Christian paradox that spiritual gain emerges through sacrifice and suffering. Hopkins suggests that true glory is not separate from struggle but is revealed through it. The kestrel symbolizes divine beauty and spiritual power. At the same time, the bird's movement also reflects humility and submission to a higher force. This duality mirrors the Christian understanding of Christ as both divine and human. Hopkins links physical energy with spiritual revelation. The bird's flight is not merely beautiful, it becomes a manifestation of divine presence. Through this connection, Hopkins proposes that nature can function as revelation of God. The poem also celebrates Christ's glory through natural imagery. Rather than presenting theology in abstract language, Hopkins embodies spiritual truths within concrete sensory experience. The natural world becomes a sacred text through which divine reality can be perceived. Another important theme is the theme of transcendence. The kestrel rises above earthly limitations, suggesting spiritual elevation and freedom. Yet the poem ultimately returns to the image of labor, earth, and embers, reminding us that transcendence must remain connected to human experience. The Windhover is written as a petrarch and sonnet. Traditionally, this form consists of an octave followed by a sestet. Hopkins adopts this classical structure but uses it in highly innovative ways. The rhyme scheme of the pattern is A B B A, A B B A, C D C, and D C D. Although the rhyme scheme appears traditional, Hopkins introduces unusual rhymes and syntax that makes a poem feel experimental. The octave focuses on the description of the kestrel while the sestet introduces reflection and interpretation. This structural shift reflects the movements from observation to spiritual insight. One of Hopkins' most important innovations in his use of use of sprung rhythm. Unlike conventional meter, sprung rhythm is based on stressed syllables rather than fixed syllable counts. This creates a dynamic and energetic movement that mirrors the flight of the bird. Hopkins also employs unconventional grammar and syntax. Sentences are compressed, inverted, and fragmented. This difficulty is deliberate because Hopkins attempts to capture intense experience with maximum precision. Thus, the poem combines traditional structure with modern experimentation. Hopkins represents the transformative part of the era. Hopkins' language is highly distinctive and often challenging. He uses archaic expressions that give the poem a solemn and elevated tone. These older forms of language also connect the poem to religious and literary traditions. Another notable feature is his use of compound words and broken syntax. Expressions such as dappled on, drawn compress several meanings into a single phrase. This technique allows Hopkins to represent complexity and movement with extraordinary intensity. The poem is rich in dense imagery and compressed expression. Hopkins avoids simple descriptive language and instead creates layered images, and um, these images appeal simultaneously to sight, sound, and emotion. Musical sound pattern play a central role in the poem. Alliteration, internal rhyme, and repeated consonant sound create rhythm and energy. The sound of the poem often imitates the movement of the bird itself. The poem also reflects emotional and spiritual intensity. Hopkins does not describe nature objectively, he responds to it with devotion and excitement. Finally, the concepts of inscape and instress are crucial. Inscape refers to the unique essence of an object, while instress refers to the force through which this essence is perceived. Hopkins believed that every element in nature reflects divine individuality, and poetry becomes a means of recognizing that uniqueness. The poem makes extensive use of metaphor. The kestrel itself functions as an extended metaphor of Christ's spiritual power and transcendence. Alliteration is another major device. Repeated consonant sound creates musicality and intensity. For example, phrases such as dappled on, drawn produce rhythmic energy and emphasize movement. Hopkins also uses oxymoron and paradox. The poem frequently combines opposites such as power and humility, beauty and suffering, transcendence and labor. These contrasts reflect the complexity of Christian theology. Imagery is central to the poem's effectiveness. Hopkins creates vivid visual impressions of the sky, wind, sunlight, soil, and fire. These images make abstract spiritual ideas tangible. Symbolism operates throughout the poem. Natural elements acquire deeper religious meanings. The kestrel symbolizes Christ, the wind symbolizes divine inspiration, and the fire symbolizes spiritual renewal. Enjambment contributes to the poem's flowing movement. Lines continuing without grammatical pauses, creating momentum and reflecting the bird's continuous motion. Internal rhyme adds further musicality and complexity. Hopkins' sound patterns are not ornamental, they intensify emotional and spiritual experience. Although the Windhover contains vivid natural imagery, it is fundamentally a religious poem. Hopkins transforms the observation of the bird into an act of spiritual meditation. The poem is semi romantic because it shares with romantic poetry a deep admiration for nature. However, unlike many romantic poets who celebrate nature as an independent force, Hopkins interprets nature through Christian theology. The dedication to Christ confirms the devotional character of the poem. The kestrel becomes a symbolic manifestation of Christ's glory and sacrifice. The act of writing itself becomes a form of worship. Hopkins does not merely describe the bird, he praises divine creation through poetic language. Poetry becomes an expression of prayer. The poem also demonstrates Hopkins' belief that nature can lead human beings towards divine truth. The physical world is not separate from spirituality, rather, it reveals spiritual reality. Through this transformation of observation into meditation, Hopkins suggests that moments of beauty in everyday life can become experiences of revelation. The kestrel functions as a central symbol in the poem. Hopkins gives the bird multiple layers of meaning, allowing it to operate simultaneously as a natural creature and spiritual figure. Most importantly, the kestrel symbolizes Christ. The bird's power, majesty, and mastery of the sky reflects divine authority. At the same time, its vulnerability and descent suggests Christ's humanity and sacrifice. Kestrel also represents grace and transcendence. Its ability to hover effortlessly into the air creates an impression of spiritual freedom. The bird appears to move beyond ordinary earthly limitations. The soaring movements of the bird parallels the idea of ascension. This association reinforces the connection between kestrel and Christ. The bird further symbolizes spiritual awakening. The speaker's emotional response indicates that the kestrel awakens deeper awareness and insight. Hopkins therefore transforms a single natural image into a rich theological symbol capable of expressing complex spiritual meanings. In Christian symbolism, wind often represents the Holy Spirit. Hopkins draws upon this tradition in the poem. A significant biblical reference appears in John 3:8. The wind blows where it will. This verse associates with wind with divine mystery and spiritual moment. By connecting the kestrel's flight to the wind, Hopkins suggests that the bird participates in divine energy. The kestrel depends upon the wind in order to hover and move. Symbolically, this dependence reflects the relation between human beings and divine grace. The wind also symbolizes inspiration. Just as the bird is carried and sustained by the wind, the poet is inspired by spiritual force. Furthermore, the movement of the wind reflects the speaker's spiritual journey. The poem itself moves from observation to revelation, guided by an invisible spiritual energy. Thus, wind becomes more than a physical element, it becomes a representation of divine presence and guidance. The sky in the poem represents transcendence and the divine realm. It functions as spiritual space which the dramatic movement of the kestrel unfolds. The phrases such as dappled dawn is particularly significant. The mixture of light and shadows suggests complexity and multiplicity. Human experience contains both joy and suffering, illumination and uncertainty. The sky also emphasizes freedom and elevation. The kestrel moves above earthly limitations, creating an image of spiritual liberation. At the same time, the dappled quality of the dawn prevents the image from becoming simplistic. Hopkins recognizes that the spiritual life involves tension and struggle as well as beauty. The bird's mastery of the sky symbolizes spiritual control and harmony. The kestrel appears perfectly aligned with the forces of nature, reflecting divine order. Through these images, Hopkins transforms the natural landscape into a symbolic representation of spiritual experience. The sun functions as a symbol of divine illumination throughout the poem. Traditionally, light is associated with truth, revelation, and spiritual awakening. The morning setting of the poem reinforces this symbolism. Dawn suggests renewal, beginning, and the emergence of clarity. The sunlight enhances the majesty of the kestrel. The bird appears radiant and almost supernatural within the illuminated sky. Hopkins also uses light to suggest moral and spiritual transformation. The movement from the darkness towards the light symbolizes the movements from ignorance or sin towards spiritual understanding. Divine light in the poem is not abstract, it becomes visible through natural beauty. Hopkins therefore unites sensory experience with theological meaning. The sun ultimately represents the glory of God manifested in creation. Through the radiance of nature, the speaker encounters spiritual truth. The imagery of soil and labor in the final section of the poem introduces a more earthly dimension. Soil represents ordinary human existence, including struggle, efforts, and suffering. Unlike the soaring kestrel, the plow moves through the ground with difficulty. However, Hopkins suggests that spiritual meaning can emerge through labor. The line about the plow shining through its movement implies that effort itself possesses dignity and beauty. The connection between heaven and earth becomes especially important here. The kestrel's descent symbolizes the union of divine and human realities. This imagery also reflects Christ's sacrifice. Just as Christ enters human suffering, the poem moves from transcendence towards earthly existence. Hopkins therefore presents suffering not as meaningless but as potentially transformative. Redemption emerges through endurance and sacrifice. Fire in the poem symbolizes transformation and spiritual renewal. Hopkins uses the image of glowing embers to suggest the hidden energy and revelation. The phrase, the fire that breaks from thee then, indicates spiritual power emerges through pressure and fragmentation. The embers shine most brightly after they are broken apart. The idea reflects Christian understanding of suffering and resurrection. The destruction becomes condition for renewal. Fire also symbolizes divine energy. It conveys intensity, passion, and purification. The image suggests that the world possesses an inner capacity for renewal and illumination. Even ordinary material contains hidden beauty. At the symbolic level, the fire imagery reinforces connection between Christ's suffering and spiritual rebirth. Through sacrifice comes revelation and transformation. Critics often describe Hopkins as a poet who combines romantic admiration of nature with Christian theology. Like the Romantics, Hopkins finds inspiration in natural beauty. However, he interprets that beauty through a deeply religious perspective. The poem reveals the unity of beauty and suffering. Hopkins refuses to separate glory from sacrifice. This tension gives the poem emotional and philosophical depth. Nature in the poem reflects divine presence. The kestrel is not simply admired for its physical grace. but it becomes an evidence of spiritual reality. The complexity of the poem mirrors the complexity of spiritual experience. Hopkins' difficult language and compressed imagery require careful interpretation, just as spiritual truth requires contemplation. Modern critics also value the poem for its innovative language. Hopkins' experimental rhythm and syntax influenced the 20th century poetry and anticipated aspects of literary modernism. As a result, the Windhover is frequently studied not only for its religious symbolism but also for its stylistic originality and intellectual richness. To conclude, the Windhover is both a nature poem and a spiritual meditation. Hopkins transforms the image of Kestrel in flight into profound reflection of divine beauty, sacrifice, and transcendence. The Kestrel becomes a symbol of Christ, spiritual power, and inspiration. Through the symbol, Hopkins explores the relationship between a natural world and divine reality. Hopkins's unique poetic style significantly enriches the poem's meaning. His use of sprung rhythm, dense imagery, and musical sound pattern creates an intense and memorable reading experience. The poem continues to inspire literary and theological interpretation because of its complexity and originality. It challenges readers to see nature not merely as a physical reality but as a source of spiritual insight. Ultimately, the Windhover remains one of the masterpieces of Victorian and religious poetry and landmark in the evolution of modern poetic language. Thank you.